Now, Nicholas Boylston, he's assistant professor at Seattle University, and he's a scholar of Islamic studies focusing on Shia studies, Quranic studies, Sufism, and Persian literature. He received his BA from Harvard College, his MA from the University of Tehran, and his PhD from Georgetown University. And from 2017 to 2021, he taught at Harvard as a lecturer and college fellow. Dr. Boylston's research focuses on themes of diversity and unity in the writings of Sufis, philosophers, and literatures from the Persianate world in both the 12 Shia and Sunni traditions. He is currently investigating the role of Quranic exegesis in the development, articulation, and negotiation of Shia Sufi thought and identity, and is writing a manuscript on Sayyid Haidar Amuli's commentary upon the Quran called The Greatest Ocean. He also studies the development of pluralistic modes of discourse, the 12th century Persian literature, and has published on Sana'i, Ain al-Quzat, and Attar. Now, I'm going to also say something about Professor Boylston's knowledge of the Persian language, which I heard from Professor Nasser myself. He referred to him as, basically being a native speaker of the language. So that's a great praise, and he's our teacher in so many things, and hopefully he'll even, as he takes us through this really, really interesting talk, he can maybe share some verses with us as well. We want to hear about Karbala, for example, Nicholas. Karbala, but also Karbala.
Thank you so much for a too kind introduction. Thank you so much to the Mohammedain for organizing this really beautiful conference. To everybody who's attending, and especially to my panelists, these have been really fascinating papers, and all of them are resonating with what I'm thinking about right now. So thank you to you all. So I'd like to begin with a quotation that might be familiar to pretty much everyone. And it's attributed in one form or another to numerous Western thinkers and poets such as Ernest Hemingway, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Leonard Cohen, but it's also attributed in a slightly different version to Jalaluddin Rumi and perhaps also his teacher Shams Tabriz. And this quotation says, "There's a crack in everything, it's where the light shines in." So I'll reflect on that a bit later. So in this paper, I'll be exploring the resources for thinking through the problem of suffering and evil using the text and performance of two poems of Nohe, Ritual Mourning for the Martyrdom of the Grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, and the third Shi Imam, Hossein ibn Ali. And I've uploaded a handout into the chat which has the text of the poems. So in particular, I'd like to explore the roles that art and beauty can play in transforming our encounter with suffering. In my title, Aesthetic Theodicy, Light from the Horizon of Karbala, I'm actually repurposing the term aesthetic theodicy, which is usually used to describe a certain type of rational argument based on the observation of the beauty of the created order as a sign that there's purpose behind suffering in creation. But instead of this, I'm going to try to point towards a theodicy, which means a solution to the problem of evil that dwells in aesthetic experience itself. But I also want to suggest that this type of aesthetic theodicy requires certain theoretical foundations. So I want to begin with Islamic philosophy and Sufism, using the thought of the 12th century Persian mystic Ain al-Qada Hamadani, and the 12th century philosopher mystic Shahabuddin Suhrawardi al-Maqtul as a jumping off point. Though perhaps an unlikely combination, all three of these sources are deeply rooted in traditions of Persian literary mystical thought, and I'm certainly grateful for the exploratory nature of this conference to try out an approach that's a bit more experimental here. I'd also like to note that though this wasn't intended, Ain al-Qada Suhrawardi and of course Hossein ibn Ali himself were aware of human suffering in the deepest sense, and each of them made the ultimate sacrifice, giving up their lives for what they stood for. So I start my exploration with the question, in order to grapple with the problem of evil, what are the tools at our disposal? Certainly reason has been the primary recourse for theologians across traditions upon whom this problem has imposed itself, but reason has its limits. This is where Ain al-Qada comes in. So in his letters to his disciples, Ain al-Qada often has occasion to discourse on the nature of suffering. He's wont to begin with rational analysis, drawing on the thought of one of his greatest intellectual influences, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, whose ideas on this have been explored in depth by Eric Ormsby. So following Ghazali, when he's in the rational modality, Ain al-Qudat points to the limited scope of our knowledge. So imagine now a child whose mother takes her to undergo surgery. The example al-Ghazali and Ain al-Qudat give us hijama, cupping, which involves making incisions in the skin, but basically it would work the same way. So the medical procedure certainly involves suffering for the child, who cannot possibly grasp the reason for it. The mother, however, is willing to subject her beloved offspring to the physician's scalpel, for though suffering is involved, there's a greater good in view, which easily justifies it. The child can submit to the wisdom and love of the mother, or she can resist, but this doesn't change the situation. Likewise, on a broader scale, human knowledge is limited. So reason calls theologians in the Islamic tradition to submit to the love, power, and wisdom of the Creator, who has arranged this world in the best possible order. Reason takes us thus far. But Ain al-Qudat intimates that it's possible to go further. Invariably, at this point in his exposition in his letters, he takes an ecstatic turn as he shifts from sober rational analysis to the elliptical poetic modality of divine intoxication. He utters the mystical disconnected letters of the Quran, Alif, Lam, Mim, Taha, Yasin, Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Sad. He transcribes the ecstatic verses of the Sufi tradition, and he points to those symbols of the problem of evil that fascinate him, particularly the mole on a beautiful face, the very imperfection of which perfects the face itself, and the hair of the beloved, which, like suffering itself, seems to obscure the view of divine goodness. And that's an image I'll be returning to later. Through these signs, Ain al-Qudat is trying to elicit the awareness that the signs of divine majesty are in fact rooted in divine unity, which transcends the very distinction between good and evil. So Ain al-Qudat is telling us that though reason has a role to play in theodicy, it may be sufficient for many, it does not represent the limit of our understanding. For Ain al-Qudat, the deeper understanding of the problem of evil has to be gained by kashf, or as he calls it, the level beyond reason, that mystical unveiling that results from Sufi practice. So inspired by Ain al-Qudat's allusion to the level of understanding of the problem of evil that lies beyond the scope of reason, I'd like to suggest here that besides the lofty goal of mystical consciousness, which often seems out of reach, all of us have access to modes of knowing that can help us gain a deeper understanding of the problem of suffering. These lie within the domain of art and the aesthetic. Indeed, I'd venture to suggest that in the Islamic tradition, as indeed other traditions in which mystical consciousness is cultivated, the domains of art and spiritual realization are not discontinuous. After all, the arts deal precisely with that concept Amr was just mentioning, dhawq or tasting, which is that immediate and non-conceptual knowledge, which in Islamic languages is one of the key terms for spiritual awareness itself. Before exploring artistic and aesthetic responses to the martyrdom of Hossein at Karbala, however, I'd like to suggest that this aesthetic response makes most sense, or perhaps may only be possible within a particular metaphysical perspective, which is in fact implied by the quotation I began with. There's a crack in everything, it's where the light shines in. First of all, this quotation only makes sense if there's such a thing as light. Now we can understand this in an Islamic context within any number of metaphysical frameworks, whether it be that of Ibn Arabi, Mullah Sadra, or Jalaluddin Rumi. But here I find the framework of the Master of Illumination, Sahabuddin Suhrawardi, to be particularly helpful. This is not to say that the poets composing Nohir were immediately thinking of Suhrawardi or Ain al-Qudat for that matter, but rather all of these thinkers produce conceptual maps of the mountain of reality, which can be a service to us. These maps differ in their cartological methods and in many details, but they are all attempts to map out the singular mountain of reality. So the saying, there's a crack in everything, it's where the light shines in, only makes sense if firstly there's light, and secondly, if this light is different from all of these things, these material objects that all have cracks in them. That is to say, it only makes sense if there's a spiritual reality, and this spirituality is different from the material reality of the things in this world in some way. So this is where Suhrawardi's philosophy of illumination helps us. For he suggests that the fundamental predicament of the human state is that ultimately, as self-conscious beings, we belong to the world of light. Indeed, the fact that we possess consciousness means that our nature is light. This can be verified by each of us. If we turn inwards for a moment, and we see that our consciousness is evident in itself and makes other things evident, which is the classical definition of light. However, we're trapped in this world of darkness, the material world, which often seems to us to be all that there is. And this too can be verified if we notice where our attention is pointed. With the exception of those of us who've gone through some specific training, for nearly all of us, the center of our attention is material objects and our own self-image. Or in the language of Suhrawardi, we're focusing on various objects of the world, which are fundamentally darkness. Indeed, even when we focus on ourselves, we're not focusing on our true I, which is fundamentally light, but on the representation of those its, or on the representation of that light itself, which becomes an it. The world and our self-image within our consciousness, and we're tied to these by desire and attachment. For Suhrawardi, this observation makes clear the task of the spiritual life through contemplation supported by philosophy and spiritual practice, which includes for him fasting, prayer, and invocation. One must separate the light of the soul from the body and hence allow it to contemplate the world of lights without intermediary. This is the process known as tajrid. Now again, taking inspiration from Suhrawardi, but keeping to our own line of thought, there's a crack in everything suggests a powerful response to the problem of evil. Evil is real on its own level. There's no doubt about that. And I believe that any theodicy that does not fully confront the horror of suffering will not sit well for many of us. I think we've seen that already in this conference several times. The crack is a real crack. The cup is broken. We may be able to piece it back together. We may gain from the suffering. We may gild the cracks with gold, or we may never be fully healed. On its own level, suffering is simply bad, full stop. In one sense, on its own level, suffering can never be justified. But there's a possible concomitant to suffering. Perceptibly or imperceptibly, suffering has the capacity to reduce the attachments of the soul to the material world. In certain cases, its effects are even more drastic. Sometimes we're not simply broken, we're broken open. To use Suhrawardi's term, suffering has the power to forge a lasting connection with the world of light. But it's clear that not all suffering does this. Otherwise, there would be no problem at all. Indeed, so much human suffering seems to lead to no good whatsoever. It can lead us into the dark. The wound can fester. It is here that I believe art has a crucial role to play. Though perhaps it's impossible to fully map out all the reasons why one instance of suffering might lead upwards and another downwards, art can help us find the difference within ourselves. It can bring us to a deeper awareness of the problem of suffering, proving analogous in a sense to the mystical consciousness that Ain al-Qadat set forth. And sometimes it can transform the suffering itself, becoming instrumental in the entrance of light. In my view, the purpose of much know-her performance may be precisely this: to cultivate a new mode of awareness through beauty, and to turn the cracks of our suffering towards the light. As many here present are aware, so now I'll turn to the discussion of the know-her poems themselves. So as many here present are aware, mourning for the martyrdom of Hossein ibn Ali, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, plays a central role in the 12 Shia tradition, acting as a spiritual and communal focal point, not only during the month of Muharram itself, in which Ashura occurs and will be in August this year, but throughout the year. These rituals hold deep significance for Shia Muslims, as well as Muslims across denominational boundaries and even across religious boundaries. So this isn't just about the Shia. This is significant potentially for everybody. For mourners, the practice plays a complex and multidimensional role, combining ritual activity, both communal and individual, moral and historical lessons, and social service through the distribution of charity or nazri. Many dimensions of this practice, and particularly its social role, have been explored by scholars, and I highly recommend that anyone interested in this take a look at Sayyid Akbar Haidar's seminal work, Relieving Karbala. But the phenomenological aspects of this commemoration of the martyrdom of Hossein at Karbala remain difficult to access. And it's here that I'd like to emphasize the importance of the literary texts and artistic practices within this commemoration. Notwithstanding differences in cultural expression based on context, the mourning rituals involve, and perhaps one could say integrate, multiple planes of the self, including the mind, through reflection on the lessons to be learned from the events that unfolded nearly 1400 years ago, the emotional dimension of the mourning itself, and the physical dimension through ritual movement and symbolic beating of the body. The artistic components of mourning draw all of this together, particularly the practice of Nohe, Rozakhani, Sinazani, Latmir, and other forms, in which poetry, music, and ritual movement are brought together to form a whole. At the heart of all these expressions of mourning is the pact of walaya, of love and affiliation between the Shia and the Imam himself, who was often treated as being spiritually present during the gathering. The reality of human suffering and the conundrums that seem to be inextricable from it are never far from the proceedings, as speeches, poems, and songs often reflect in detail on the physical sufferings that the Imam and the household of the Prophet endured. The images and ideas associated with the commemoration of the events of Karbala draw into a strict duality. The Imam, who according to Shia belief is himself immaculate and simply exists in order to guide humanity to the light, and his pure family are surrounded and overcome by the forces of darkness. The physical and emotional suffering of the family of the Prophet is real and is often experienced by mourners as just as intensely as if it were physically present before them in that very moment. But as the poetry I will discuss suggests, there's also a great victory here. Imam Hussein has fulfilled his divinely willed destiny. He's been united with his beloved grandfather, father, and mother in paradise, and his death set in motion a moral awakening of the Islamic community and opposition to the Umayyad dynasty who were responsible for the tragedy, an awakening that will lead to the consolidation of not only the early Shia community, but also the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. What's more, for many Shia, the martyrdom of Hussein has opened a new doorway to salvation for those who mourn him, often referred to as the widest door of paradise. For in Shia belief, the pact of walaya and the tears that are shed lead to paradise and extinguish the fires of hell. So the ritual recollection of the martyrdom of Hussein at Karbala provides a powerful case for us to explore how artistic creation and aesthetic experience can transform suffering. The main preconditions of the approach to suffering I've described above are already present. That is, the commemoration of Karbala is always premised on a higher reality beyond the physical world, whether that be understood as the paradise that the Imam is traditionally depicted as entering immediately after martyrdom, the spiritual reality of the Imam's walaya that the mourners seek affiliation with, or the metaphysical domain of light beyond the physical. Though 12 mourning rituals tend to focus most of all on the suffering itself, the background of this higher reality, the light that can shine through the broken vessels of earthly existence, is always present. But it is the rituals themselves that above all put the pieces together, allowing participants and listeners to discover how light shines through the suffering of Karbala and potentially also into their own individual suffering, which they carry with them to the ritual. In order to explain what I have in mind, I'll analyze two Nohe poems, which were sung as a single performance by Hossein Fakhri in the early hours of the morning of December 16th, 2010, the night of Ashura in Khorramshahr, which is significant for other reasons. The video of this performance has been widely viewed on YouTube, where it's entitled The Most Beautiful Nohe, and I'll present and comment on each of the two poems in turn, suggesting how they relate to our discussion. Now, on pains of eating into my question answer time, I have to show the performance, which is about 10 minutes. So 2 5-minute performance. I just have to in order to
no problem.
All right,
No
thanks
problem.
so much, Mohammed. So I'll share the screen, show the first half. I've put in subtitles, and then we'll discuss the first half, and then we'll do the second half.
واحد تشنه بری لب تشنه بری لب تشنه بری لب تشنه تشنه بری لب تشنه بری لب تشنه بری لب تشنه خنجر بری تار خنجر بری تار خنجر بری تار خنجر Barilay Beteshne, Barilay Beteshne, Barilay Beteshne. Hanjar, baritore hanjar, baritore hanjar, baritore hanjar. Davar khoab kudak bitab, kudak bitab. کودک بی‌تا خاموش طفل در آغوش طفل در آغوش طفل در آغوش زینب آیه ها برلم آیه ها برلم آیه ها برلم خواهر داغ برادر داغ برادر داغ برادر عباس بوی گل یاس بوی گل یاس بوی گل یاس اکبر لاله پر پرور لاله پر پرور لاله پر پرور بیدار سینه تبدار سینه تبدار سینه تبدار فریاد این همه بیداد این همه بیداد این همه بیداد هی هات شام خراب آباد شام خراب آباد گوریان محفل یاران محفل یاران محفل یاران
Right, so that's the first one. So this first poem stands out among Notha texts, above all for the delicacy of its presentation of key images from the tragedy at Karbala. The poem relies above all on the collective memory of the meaning-saturated images and characters of the historical account, the vast network of literary works surrounding the commemoration of Ashura, including Maqtal texts, the Ta'ziyah Passion plays, Notha poetry, and Rosa Khani. The poet can thus conjure forth a vast palette of images and motions for the audience with the briefest and most delicate of allusions. The opening line, "A dagger upon thirsty lips," immediately brings to mind the suffering of the family of the Prophet on the plains of Karbala, denied access to water by the Umayyad army for several days in the searing desert heat. The images that follow expand on this powerful contrast here between the brutality of the event and the delicacy and beauty of character of the members of Hussein's family. Asleep, a baby in the arms brings forth the image of the innocent child, and this is, of course, Ali Asghar, whom listeners know will be one of the last casualties of the massacre, killed by an arrow when Hussein calls on the Umayyads to have mercy on his innocent child and provide water. Zainab verses on her lips, a sister burning for her brother, calls to mind the entire story of Zainab, daughter of Ali, who stands for justice and will eventually confront the Caliph Yazid himself. Abbas and Ali Akbar, Hussein's half-brother and one of his older sons, are compared to flowers, for though heroic warriors, they would become the center of devotion for the household of the Prophet in their own rights. And this seemingly cryptic line, "awake with feverish chest," is of course, as Sarah mentioned, reference to Ali ibn al-Hussein Zain al-Abidin, the fourth Imam, who was the only adult male spared the massacre due to his lying convalescent. When we hear that he was awake, a single word that brings to mind his awareness of all that was transpiring around him and his powerlessness to do anything to stop it. The pivotal line in the poem I would suggest is "Cry out all of this injustice, faryad in hame bidad," which brings together the whole affair. Just as previous lines through their indeterminacy bring forth all the more images and associations, this line becomes the most universal of the piece, and many listeners may here interpret the universal message of Karbala, often repeated in Noha texts, that the tragedy of the murder of Hussein stands for all suffering. Every day is Ashura, and every land is Karbala. For can we not all look around at the world around us and say, cry out all of this injustice? The poem ends with the aftermath of the massacre as the Umayyad army sets fire to the tents of the remaining members of the prophetic household while many of them are still inside. And this calls forth what is often commemorated as a separate event on the evening of Ashura, Sham Ghariban, the evening of outcasts, with the image of burning tents in the dark night serving as a point of remembrance for the entire tragedy that has unfolded. So this first poem does three things. First, it calls forth the ritual memory of the events of Karbala. Secondly, and crucially for our discussion, it elicits love through the delicacy of the performance itself and the images of the poetry. And thirdly, it opens up to a universalization of suffering of the household, which may potentially include all human suffering. So now I'm going to play the second part of the performance, which is quite different.
آتش شعله سرکش شعله سرکش شعله سرکش بوسته تور خیمه خاکستر خیمه خاکستر خیمه خاکستر عالم غرق در ماتمم غرق در ماتمم غرق در ماتمم بر لب ناله های
So you're showing us a video?
I am, you can't see it?
No, we just see a blank screen.
Yeah,
Actually.
exactly.
Or was that true from the beginning?
Yeah, just for
Oh,
this
right.
clip, yeah.
Just for this clip? The previous clip, did you see?
Oh yeah, yeah, we saw the first one, but this
All right.
one, we can just have a visual.
All right, let me just try sharing it again. Sorry about that. So actually, this was still the end of the first clip, but it's about to shift. Can you see that now? Or it's still?
No, I'm just looking at a blank screen.
All right, there's some technical problems. So what I'd ask you to do is to open up the handout I've sent out, and then you can hear it. You know, the physical movements are basically the same, and then you'll hear the performance, and then you can read the translation on the handout. So apologies for that technical problem. I don't know what the difference is this time. I'll just try one more time. Someone shout out if assembly comes back.
Yeah.
It's back?
No. It's,
Did you click on that share multimedia box?
That last time it worked. It's okay, optimized for video clip. Now, how about now? Can you see it?
Yes.
yes.
Yes, I can see it.
جز دلم کسی نکند دلبری با دلبر من جز دلم کسی نکند دل بری با دل بر من دل بر عشق بازی کند بر سر نی با سر من جز دلم کسی نکند دل بری با دل بر من جز دلم کسی نکند دل بری با دل بر من دل بر عشق بازی کند بر سر نی با سر من یا رب این دشت بیلا یا که طربی خانه ما کسی نیدانستی که عروسی بود دینی یا که ازا هرچه دارم به تماشاه گه زلفت را هرچه دارم به تماشاه گه زلفت ریزم جای زر در قدمت من سر و جان می ریزم جز دلم کسی نکند دل بری با دل بر من دل بر عشق بازی کند بر سر نی با سر من کرده پر خون جگر دست ازل جام می را ایزد نقاش ازل عظیم می را رنگ بیلا بعد من خواهر من غافل سالار منی بعد من خواهر من غافل سالار منی در پس پرده غیب شاهد اسرار منی شاهد غارت و غارت گر گلزار منی شاهد غارت و غارت گر گلزار منی زیر شمشیر و سنان طالب دیدار منی سوز و آه و غم ما ساده و یک بازی نیست سوز و آه و غم ما ساده و یک بازی نیست هر که دارد غم جان لایق جان بازی نیست هر که دارد غم جان لایق عشق بازی نیست تا میلا متین کشی عشق نزند خلق بدر تا میلا متین کشی عشق نزند خلق بدر نشود سنگ طلب تا نخوری خون جگر کی کنم شکوه از این چرخ پر از این نقش و نگار کی کشم منت از این طارم فیروز سوار کی کشم منت از این طارم فیروز سوار صحبت از بریدن سر ز قیفاس با شمشیر صحبت از بریدن سر ز قیفاس با شمشیر صحبت از خوردن آب ز گلو از لب تیر.
So the second poem is quite different from a literary point of view, displaying the height of complexity of the Persian literary tradition. It's really a masterpiece. The first line, "Except my heart, no one takes the heart of my heart taker, just delam kas nakona del bari ba del bariman," is extremely difficult to translate. It calls forth the imagery of the classical Persian ghazal. To be in love is to lose your heart, so the beloved is the heart taker. The roles of lover and beloved, however, are here reversed in this paradoxical line. The narrative voice of the poem declares that he is the only one the beloved has fallen in love with, in a classical Sufi reversal, where the most advanced lovers of God become God's own beloved. The second line is perhaps the most powerful in the whole poem. For as we hear that my heart taker makes love play with my head on the head of a spear, we realize that the speaker is none other than Hossein himself. The tragedy of the first poem, which we could call the conventional response to the events of Ashura, is flipped. We now see that Hossein is the supreme lover of God, and the devastating events at Karbala are shown to be the sport between lover and beloved. Indeed, the most heartbreaking of images of Hossein's head atop the spear of his murderers is recast as divine love play. Such a reversal, though losing none of its power, is also something woven into the fabric of the commemoration of Ashura throughout history, as even in the early historical texts, we hear the story of the head of Hossein being paraded on the spear through the streets, and a follower of Hossein through spiritual vision, hearing the head itself recite the famous verse from Surah Al-Kahf, now with its meaning inverted. And the head says, "Dost thou reckon that the companions of the cave and the inscription are a marvel among our signs?" The following lines strike right at the heart of our discussion of suffering here at this conference. "O Lord, these plains of tribulation are the dust of our house of joy. No one knew if this was a wedding or a funeral." Just as the crack in everything, which is loss in itself, lets the light shine through, the suffering of Hossein and the prophetic household remains inherently tragic, but became force that by all accounts led to an awakening of the conscience of the Islamic world in the 7th century and served as the center of devotion for Shia through the past 1400 years. Building on the paradox of this line, the poem again draws on the complexity of the Persian poetic tradition as Hossein declares, "I pour everything I have at the place I witness those sweeping locks of the hair of the beloved." And as I alluded before when considering Ain al-Qada, the locks of the hair of the beloved are a symbol saturated with meaning. Not simply a sign of the beauty of the beloved, they represent the veiling of the divine face, and hence everything that seems to veil one from God. This image indeed came to be a symbol of all suffering and all apparent evil. Hossein embraces the suffering of his destiny that both hides and he embraces the suffering of his destiny and all and the sacrifice he makes outside the veil, while knowing that it is a veil that both hides and reveals. All of these lines resonate strongly with the words following Ashura uttered by Zainab herself. "I saw nothing but the beautiful. Ma ra'aytu illa jamila." Indeed, Zainab is called by Hossein in the poem to stand as witness to all that has transpired, to lead the family of the Prophet after him. But the inner meaning of the event is also brought forth by the poet, who declares that it is Zainab who witnesses the deepest mysteries of Hossein's sacrifice. We could also wonder if the lines that follow are again heard with a universal meaning. For the words, "Beneath the sword and the spearhead, you seek the meeting with me," are true not only of Zainab, but of all the Shia commemorating Ashura and thus seeking a spiritual connection with Hossein. But lest the love imagery of the poem should be taken wrongly as saying that the teaching of finding illumination in suffering is easy, the final lines of the poem serve as a reminder. "Our burning, our sighs, and our sorrow, neither simple nor a game is this." This second poem then opens out onto a transformed awareness of the horror and beauty of Hossein's sacrifice, indicating that to recognize the deeper meaning of suffering, the divine love play behind the apparent evil of life, one has to be willing to endure blame, to have the blood of one's liver turned to ruby, and potentially to sacrifice all. So in conclusion, I've woven together here several threads to help us respond to the problem of evil. I began by suggesting the ways that Ain al-Qada pointed us beyond reason in our search for finding resolution to this problem. And I suggested that in addition to the mystical awareness that he seeks to communicate, we can also use art and beauty as means to transform our response to suffering. I then turned to Shahabuddin Suhrawardi to outline some of the necessary metaphysical foundation of this aesthetic theodicy, usefully summarized by the common quotation, "There's a crack in everything. That's where the light shines in." I then turned to a literary analysis of two Noha poems, which present a poetic and musical response to the paradoxes inherent not only in the martyrdom of Hossein, but also perhaps in all human suffering. The suffering remains real and intrinsically evil on its own level, but has the potential within the right metaphysical and ritual framework to lead to profound transformation and illumination, unlocked for the Shi participants through beauty and through love for the Imam. These poems suggest, therefore, that perhaps the best response to suffering is not only to sit and think, but also to sing and dance. Thanks very much.
Okay, very good. Can you hear me, Nicholas?
Yes.
Oh, very good. Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. That was a very powerful lecture, and the images and the music and your analysis of the images and the poems or the nohas were very touching. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Now, what we're going to do is we're going to open up the floor for discussions or questions, if there are any. If there are not, then I could at least, maybe I could use this opportunity to ask Nicholas a question. You know, when you said that, you know, you kind of linked this question of suffering, and you see a connection of which is, you know, quite obvious, of course, between Imam Hussein on the one hand, and then Hallaj and Suhavari and Quzat on the other. And I find that much of the literature, when you get into the literature, especially in Sufi texts, they tend to leave Imam Hussein out of that equation. When they look at the three Qutala, Shuhada in Sufism, it's always going to be Ain Quzat, Suhavari, and Hallaj. You know, and there are at least 2 or 3 books I've seen in Arabic like this, right? Like Sara'at Tasawwuf recently. But that's to our detriment, of course, because Imam Hussein is that's the archetype, that's the archetypal sufferer. So I wanted to see if you can just share some insights about how, you know, in our own work, those of us who are concerned with writing on Sufi topics can bring more of Imam Hussein into the discussion, especially when it is concerned with Shahida Karbala in this way.
Thanks so much, Mohammed. Perhaps one thing to do is just bring to light more material that's there and people haven't looked at, because this was so common in especially the pre-modern world in Sufism. In the Ottoman period, we had a phenomenon of 12 Sunni thought. So the Hussein, the Ahlul Bayt have been so important. And Karbala is certainly commemorated across the Islamic world in Sunni context as well. For me personally, I'm fascinated by the Sufi Shi'i overlap. And I'm really, you know, looking for time to go and work on Safi Ali Shah, who has a whole work on Karbala and things like that. So we tend to separate things into boxes and to say Sufism is one thing and Shiism or 12 Shiism or Ismaili thought is another thing. And there's some truth to that in some contexts, and then in other contexts, these categories just don't work at all. And we have kind of intersectional identities, and as that poem showed, you know, it's completely continuous with the Persian Sufi literary tradition. It's also completely continuous with Shi'i mourning. So yeah, it would be lovely to bring more of that to light. I fully agree with you.
Yeah, as a child, I remember hearing, or I think it was Imam Khomeini had a poem, and it was in Persian, and I don't know where I'd seen it. I was probably like a teenager, I guess. I don't know. And I thought to myself, oh my God, this is a Sufi poem. What is this? He's saying he's like Hallaj, and of course it works the other way, exactly as you said. And there's so many examples, right? Like the Kashafi, for example, and so much cross in intercommunal relations.
Attar has a lot on this. Wherever you look for it, you start finding it. I think we just need to bring it to light. So Attar has a statement in the beginning of Mukhtar Nama where he talks about the infallibility of Hassan Hussein and Hussein's 9 offspring and things like that. So there's a lot of this material, and so many of Sanai's Hadiqa starts with praise of Hassan and Hussein as well as Ali and the Prophet and the Khulafa and things like that. So it's all out there. We just need to stop our own kind of mental conceptual constructions blocking us from seeing the way the tradition really was.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. Tarana has a question. She said, thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed the use of video. I am curious, do you think that suffering is a condition for certain kinds of authority? So is suffering a condition for certain kinds of authority? And if so, does that apply for those who have a mystical consciousness, or also for those who explore suffering in aesthetics? If not, or neither, then what are the reasons for suffering not being a ground of authority? If I could just kind of summarize what I think she's asking is, Yeah. So for those who have a mystical, right, right. I guess the point is, does the aesthetic experience of suffering, right? Does that itself, is that rooted in an authority, kind of like, let's say it's an authorial person who's suffering, authoritative individual, like Imam Hussein's suffering wouldn't be the suffering of an ordinary person. So then the aesthetic dimension of that point of suffering heightens our conscious awareness of the sufferer. I think that's what she's asking.
Yeah, there's lots and lots to think about, and would be a whole conversation to have over coffee, I think. But basically, I mean, I can just speak about my understanding of the Shi'i tradition. It would be like a Venn diagram where there can be authority without suffering, and there can be authority with suffering. Obviously, Imam Hussein's case is deeply important, and most 12 Shia would say that all of the imams, except for the 12th imam, were martyred and were killed unjustly. But that's not what makes them imams. They're made in the Shi'i tradition. They're made imams because that authority is bestowed on them by God. They're selected by God to have that spiritual function. Now, in terms of the aesthetics, in the Shi'i tradition, yeah, that authority is central because it's the pact of wilaya, which is, I asked my students to come to research the term, and one student came up with 72 meanings of this word. So everybody in the field knows how complex it is, but I like to summarize it as love, sanctity, and authority. That pact with the imam as all the idea in the Quran that the prophet is more worthy than the believers than they are to themselves. Awla bil mu'minina min anfusihim. So this idea of authority is central to the Shi'i tradition, but it's a pact of kind of unity, but it's also a pact of love as well. So that's really important in this tradition. I couldn't universally, I think some of what I'm saying could be applied in other contexts. There, I wouldn't. It's too broad a question. Have to really think about that.
Yeah. When I think many years ago, when Muhammad Ayub had published his book Redemptive Suffering in Islam, that really took a lot of people by surprise. Especially when Islamic studies had been, not looking at many of these Shia materials with any seriousness. And then when he wrote that book, it kind of just opened up the discussions. And the whole question of redemptive suffering, I'm not sure. A lot of that's probably informed by Christian categories, perhaps the late good professor brought to his study. But I was wondering, do you think that's a meaningful category, like the idea of not just suffering and not just the aesthetic point of suffering, but specifically of redemption? Where does that fit into all of this?
That's a really fascinating question. I've thought a lot about this because in some ways it works and in some ways it doesn't. So too much of an equation with Christianity is wrong. It doesn't seem that the purpose of mourning of Hussein and feeling sad and self-flagellation, it doesn't seem to be the purpose that, we're so terrible. That doesn't seem to be how people go into it. It's something else, and so it's quite different from the sometimes overblown images of kind of Catholic self-flagellation and that kind of thing in Opus Dei and things like that. But there is this idea in the tradition, and there's akhbar, there's reports from the Shi'i imams that weeping for Imam Hussein puts out the fires of paradise, and that Hussein is the ark of salvation, and therefore this practice of mourning for Hussein is salvific. I'm not sure yet if I'd want to use the term redemptive, because I'm not sure if it's firstly about sin first and foremost, but it is considered salvific. So it's a really well put and interesting question that I'm looking forward to thinking more about.
Yeah, that's good. So more, you're saying that it intersects more closely with what we would relate to as deliverance, kind of najat, right? The deliverance from. That's really interesting. Amir, you have a question, Amir Latif?
It's more of a comment, I think, and thank you, Nicholas. It was just really beautiful, deeply moving. It's a good thing the cameras were turned off. Yeah, it's such a imagination of that moment. I think just really reaches deep within. To go back to the question of aesthetics, I have on occasion thought of Sufi Sama and gatherings where poetry is recited, or whether it's performed, qawwali is performed. I've used the term circles of consolation for it, in a sense of keeping in line with the kind of thesis I was arguing earlier on, that it's a way of living with the pain along with others by sharing it. So it is an aestheticization, but what it does is that it creates a container which we can hold it together, something that feels bigger. And when you fall down, as can be seen in a lot of Sufi gatherings, somebody picks you up. There's people to actually take you when you're physically unable, when you overcome, whether in the Shi context by too much bleeding or too much overcome by the emotion. There are people who take care of you so that a certain level is or threshold is not crossed. I don't know, just wanted to offer that to you.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's a really interesting point of comparison, and there's a lot of different types of Sufi gathering. I've heard in Jarahi gatherings them recite Marthia for Imam Hossein as well, and I think that's one level, and then there's many other levels going on. So I don't want to push the comparison. The visuals were striking there for the people who know have seen Sufi gatherings, but I don't want to push those comparisons. That's something again to really sit and think about and explore. But those resonances make a lot of sense.
Yeah, very good. And the passing out, the passing out image during the Matam ceremonies, that's also you've seen that, right? That's a staple of, especially Muharram. That's a staple. So that's actually the first when I first seen Sufi Sama gatherings, I thought to myself, this is like from a ritual perspective, on one level, it was very close to the matam, and I was thinking to myself, what's the connection between these? Yeah, the stylization, of course, is very different and other things, but good. Okay, so Nicholas, I think our time with you is up. We're doing very good for time, but we want to. Anthony Shakir he says here, what we call redemption is a common theme in the Sufi and philosophical literature, but unrelated to the Latin Christian interpretations. Eastern Christians have a closer interpretation to I think what he means to Sufi interpretation, to this. Thank you, Professor Boylston, for this journey. Wonderful. Good. All right, now, Nicholas, do you have anything else to add or to finish off with anything about the Ranj or Karbala that I was
No, thank you. I took too much time, and I apologize for that.
No, it was beautiful. We could hear you speak about this all day, really.